Welcome to the deep dive.
Today we're taking a close look, a real deep dive into a set of sources about the war in Ukraine and its many impacts.
Yeah, we've got quite a stack here. Research on corruption, detailed reports looking at the human and environmental costs, some analysis of different international viewpoints, and the latest data on people displaced within Ukraine.
Exactly. And our mission today really is to try and unpack all of this, to get past the headlines and understand the complexity of it all.
Right, see how these different challenges and, frankly, different ways of seeing the conflict are all connected.
We want to help you get a clearer picture, drawing directly from this material. It's sort of a shortcut to getting well informed on these really vital issues.
Okay, so let's dive in. When you're trying to grasp the impact of a war like this, where do you even start?
It has to be the human reality, doesn't it? The immediate cost for the people of Ukraine. Our sources give us a few ways to measure that. Let's start with the IOM report. That's the International Organization for Migration. Their data from January 2025.
Okay, the IOM report. That focuses on displacement within the country, right?
Yeah.
What's the scale we're talking about?
Well, it estimates there are still around 3.665 million internally displaced persons, IDPs, inside Ukraine.
Wow.
And alongside them, about 4.238 million returnees. Now, these are people who were displaced but have managed to go back to their homes, still within Ukraine, though.
Just staggering numbers. Millions still unable to go home. Where are these IDPs mainly coming from?
The report identifies the top three origin oblasts. Those are like regions as Donetsk, Kharkivska, and Kherson.
Areas that have seen intense fighting, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And where are they now? The top three destination oblasts are Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkivska, and Kiev City.
It's interesting, Kharkivska is in both lists, a top origin and a top destination.
It is, yeah. And that points to something the report highlights. The split between moving to a totally different region that's intra-oblast displacement, about 73% of IDPs are moving just within the same region, intra-oblast, which is 27%.
So a lot of people try to stay relatively close if they can.
That seems to be the preference, yes. Especially, the report notes, for more vulnerable groups like the elderly, who might rely on local support networks. Staying near home seems important.
And how long have people been living like this? Is it mostly recent displacement or?
It's definitely a mix, but long-term displacement is very common. In places like Kiev City, Lvivska, Zaporizhzhia, Kievska Oblast, you find many people who've been displaced for over 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah. But then the report also shows recent waves, like within the last 3 months before the report date, mainly from those current frontline areas, like Sumska and Donetsk. The conflict just keeps forcing people to move.
What about Ukrainians who actually left the country and have now come back?
The IOM tracks that too. They estimate around 355,000 people have returned from abroad.
Okay.
And where are they now? Top spots are Kiev City, Kharkivska, Kievska Oblast, similar to the IDP destinations. And where did they come from originally? Before leaving. Again, heavily impacted areas. Donetsk, Kharkivska, Kherson.
So it's this constant complex movement inside the country, outside, back again.
Precisely. A huge population shift.
Okay, so that's the displacement picture. What about the direct, tragic human cost? Casualties. The SGR report, Scientists for Global Responsibility, touches on this, but acknowledges how hard it is to get firm numbers.
Extremely hard. Estimating casualties in wartime always comes with huge uncertainties, and these figures show that. The UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, they verified around 7,000 civilian deaths from weapons use back in 2022.
Verified 7,000.
But they strongly emphasize the actual figure is likely considerably higher. You see other estimates, like from the U.S. military around late 2022, suggesting maybe 40,000 total casualties. That includes injuries, too.
And then there are those horrific reports from specific places.
Right. Ukrainian sources cited in the report suggested over 33,000 civilian deaths just in Mariupol alone. The gap between verified numbers and estimated or localized reports is just vast. It really shows the difficulty.
It really does.
The SGR report also gives an estimate for total direct deaths from weapons, including combatants, putting it around 100,000 for 2022. But crucially, it also talks about indirect deaths.
Indirect deaths. How does that work in this context?
Think about everything else the war breaks. Damage to hospitals, water systems, power grids. People dying from lack of medical care, from diseases spreading because sanitation is gone, even from pollutants released by the fighting itself. These aren't direct hits from weapons, but they're caused by the conflict's impact.
And the scale of that.
The report estimates these indirect deaths in the conflict zones could be comparable in number to the direct deaths from weapons, so potentially adding another 100,000 or so bringing the total deaths in those areas in 2022 towards maybe 200,000.
Wow.
The key point here is that the true human cost goes way beyond the battlefield. Destroying infrastructure is, well, it's a silent killer too. And the report specifically mentions explosive weapons used in populated areas, towns. Cities cause the vast majority of civilian harm.
It's just devastating. To bring it back to the daily reality for those displaced, the IOM report also looked at their most urgent needs, right, and how they're coping.
Yes, it gives that ground-level perspective. What did IDPs say they needed most urgently? Power banks, generators absolutely vital with the energy infrastructure damage. Then, ways to earn income, accommodation, medicines, basic survival needs, fundamentally disrupted.
And when those basics aren't there, how are people getting by? What coping strategies are they using?
A whole range, many of them quite harsh. Those common things people were reported doing were buying cheaper food, 3%. 60% did that. Cutting back on heating or electricity, 56%. Reducing spending on essential healthcare, 52%, which is really worrying.
Yeah, cutting back on health.
Spending savings, 52%. Relying on humanitarian aid, 30%.
Burning through savings, cutting healthcare. It sounds like people are really pushed to the limit.
They absolutely are. The report found that a quarter of IDPs had either adopted or completely exhausted what they call emergency-level strategies.
Like what?
Really desperate measures. Things like having to ask strangers for money or finding income sources that are degrading just to survive. And it highlights that families with members who are chronically ill or have disabilities, they face particular hardship and are much more likely to resort to these severe strategies, including cutting back on that essential health spending.
It paints such a stark picture of the need.
The sheer scale of it, yeah.
Yep.
And the difficult choices people face every day.
So that's the immediate human pull within Ukraine. But as you mentioned, the sources show the war's impact ripples much further out. The SGR report broadens that view to the global costs.
Exactly. This conflict wasn't contained. It was a major factor in fueling global inflation. We all saw it, especially hitting prices for food, fuel, fertilizers, disrupting those really critical supply chains everywhere.
We definitely felt that at the grocery store and the gas pump, didn't we?
Yes. And the report links this directly to increased poverty and hunger globally. It cites a 2022 estimate from the World Food Program suggesting the war pushed an extra 20 million people worldwide into extreme poverty.
20 million.
And an extra 47 million into acute food insecurity. It also talks about fuel poverty people, unable to afford energy for heating and basics. It gives the UK as an example, where millions more households were struggling, even with government price caps in place. The key thing here is just how fast a regional war can destabilize global food and energy systems.
And beyond the economy, there are the environmental costs, too.
Yeah.
Maybe less visible day to day for most of us, but significant.
Very significant. The SGR report tries to quantify some of this. You have the direct emissions, military vehicles burning fuel, huge fires from shelling, explosions, emissions from millions of refugees moving, plus major incidents like the Nord Stream pipeline leaks releasing massive amounts of methane.
Right.
Just those direct emissions, they estimated around 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in the first 7 months alone.
That's huge.
And they estimated another 50 million tons just from the eventual reconstruction efforts. But here's the really crucial point the report makes. The bigger potential climate impact might actually come from the decisions made away from the battlefield. Think about the global scramble for energy security. Countries trying to reduce reliance on Russian gas led to this push for more fossil gas infrastructure worldwide, more oil and gas exploration. That, combined with big jumps in military spending globally, militaries have enormous carbon footprints could collectively push climate goals, like staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius, basically out of reach.
So the environmental fallout isn't just the war itself, but the global reaction to it.
That's the key insight, yes. The long-term environmental legacy might be shaped more by those policy responses than the direct destruction.
Okay, so we've looked at the human cost, the global economic and environmental fallout. This naturally leads us to think about the future, about rebuilding Ukraine. And our sources make it clear that this massive task is tangled up with another huge challenge inside Ukraine: corruption. The U4 report dives into this.
It does. Rebuilding will need enormous investment, international and domestic. And making sure that money is used effectively, that it doesn't just, disappear or fuel more corruption, is absolutely vital. The U4 report says there's actually broad agreement, internationally and within Ukraine, on the main anti-corruption priorities needed.
Okay, what are those widely agreed upon areas?
Things like strengthening the dedicated anti-corruption bodies, serious judicial reform, fixing public financial management, like how government contracts are awarded, how state companies are run, licensing, taxes, ensuring transparency, promoting competition in business, and having strong oversight. These are seen as the basic building blocks.
So there's consensus on what needs to be done. Where does the disagreement come in?
It's more about the how, especially regarding the structure for managing reconstruction aid. The report highlights attention here. Ukrainian voices tend to favor national coordination platforms, arguing for efficiency and Ukrainian ownership of the process. But international donors, understandably concerned about their funds, often push for new, dedicated bodies focused specifically on tracking, auditing, and overseeing the money.
So a clash between sovereignty and donor control, essentially.
You could see it that way. The source calls it an impasse, basically. Donor anxiety about fiduciary risk, the risk of money being misused, bumping up against respect for Ukrainian sovereignty and managing its own recovery. It shows that even with shared goals, the practical setup for international aid gets really complex politically and logistically.
And this isn't happening in a vacuum. Ukraine had existing challenges with corruption, didn't it?
That's a critical point the U4 report makes. There are deep-rooted legacy issues that make reconstruction particularly vulnerable to corruption.
Such as?
A history of awarding big contracts to politically connected companies. Something called regulatory capture, where powerful industries basically influence the rules in their favor, creating monopolies. Organized crime penetrating parts of law enforcement, a judiciary widely seen as compromised, and weaknesses in how private businesses themselves are governed. These were problems before the full-scale invasion.
And has the war itself changed the dynamics?
Yes, the report discusses wartime trends too. Under martial law, power has become more centralized in the executive branch. Now, arguably, that helped with rapid decision-making in the crisis, maybe even initial oversight of emergency funds.
But the risk?
The concern is about long-term executive dominance and the potential for state capture, where powerful private interests gain too much influence over government decisions, especially during the massive reconstruction phase. The report also mentions the ongoing challenge from oligarchic spoilers, and a sense at times of maybe a lack of consistent focus or coordination on anti-corruption efforts amid the intense pressures of war.
So it's like old problems meeting new pressures.
Exactly. Reconstruction faces this double whammy, pre-existing weaknesses compounded by new wartime realities.
The report also looks at the specific anti-corruption actors in Ukraine. How are they faring? Let's start with those specialized institutions like NABU and SCPO and the HACC court.
Right. These were set up after 2014 specifically to tackle high-level corruption. NABU investigates, SCPO prosecutes, and HACC is the specialized court. They've definitely faced pushback, resistance, attempts to undermine their independence or install loyalists. Challenges include things like leadership positions, sometimes staying vacant for long periods, and the fact that they still have to rely on cooperation from other parts of the system that might not be reformed.
But have they had any impact? Any successes?
Yes, the source does point to important successes. The HACC has secured convictions, and that there was a notable institutional response to some major procurement scandals that emerged in early 2023. Interestingly, some experts cited in the report see these institutions as actively disrupting Russia's long-term strategy of trying to control Ukraine partly through corruption.
That's a fascinating idea. Anti-corruption as a form of defense.
It is. Some even suggest Putin's invasion might have been partly motivated by seeing these anti-corruption efforts actually starting to bite.
But I assume there are other views.
Oh, definitely. Other analysts quoted argue that despite these bodies, there weren't really significant improvements on the ground in overall corruption levels before the war. And they worry that the war itself has actually reduced the capacity of these institutions as staff get diverted to war-related tasks like documenting war crimes. So conflicting assessments of their overall effectiveness.
What about civil society and the media? They were seen as really strong reform drivers before 2022.
Ukraine had, and still has, a very vibrant civil society and independent media. They were absolutely crucial after the Maidan Revolution in pushing for reforms. But the war has hit them hard. Capacity is drastically reduced. Many activists have shifted completely. They're delivering humanitarian aid, investigating war crimes. The psychological burden is immense, too. The report notes that, understandably, early in the invasion, civil society was maybe less critical of the government, focusing on national unity.
But that's changing.
It seems public demand for anti-corruption action is rising again. A USAID poll from 2022 indicated growing frustration. People want accountability, even in wartime.
And the media situation.
That's also shifted. Some oligarch-owned TV channels have faced restrictions. Now, that could potentially curb oligarch influence on public opinion, which many see as positive. But others worry it might also constrain independent reporting and media freedom overall, especially under wartime conditions. So the traditional watchdogs are operating in a very different, very difficult environment.
And then there's the judiciary, often seen as the biggest stumbling block.
That definitely comes through in the sources. Analysts widely view the judiciary overall as still compromised and largely ineffective when it comes to tackling corruption. There's talk of an old guard, of judges resisting reform, problems with appointments, known links to oligarchs, bribery being an issue, especially in lower courts.
Yeah.
And the Constitutional Court has actually blocked anti-corruption reforms in the past.
Sounds pretty grim.
It is a major challenge, but there are some positive notes. The report mentions the dissolution of a particularly notorious court in Kiev, the District Administrative Court, as a significant step. Its head was known for, well, problematic connections.
Right.
And remember, the AKCC, the High Anti-Corruption Court, was created precisely because the regular courts weren't handling the big corruption cases from NBU effectively. Its judges went through an international vetting process, which gives it more credibility, and its early results are seen as more promising. But system-wide judicial reform, that remains probably the toughest nut to crack.
So looking ahead to reconstruction, what specific ideas are being floated to try and prevent corruption from undermining it all?
Several concrete mechanisms are discussed in the U4 report. One obvious one is just strengthening those existing agencies, NABU, SAPO, HACC, giving them more people, more resources, and crucially, real independence.
Makes sense. Any more radical ideas?
There are some, like maybe bypassing the existing system for the most serious reconstruction-related corruption cases. The idea of creating a special elite unit, vetted police, prosecutors, judges, just to handle those.
A kind of parallel track.
Sort of, yeah. There's also a debate about focus. Should the priority be punitive measures catching and prosecuting offenders, or more on prevention? Things like really boosting market competition, strong antitrust policies to stop new monopolies forming during the rebuild. Interestingly, almost everyone agrees that stimulating genuine competition is vital, both for getting value for money and for reducing corruption risks.
Any specific laws being suggested?
Yes. Things like guaranteeing clear rights for investors in public-private partnerships, which would be important for reconstruction. Making public participation mandatory in local budgeting and planning for reconstruction projects, and ensuring the public has a say in decisions made by any national reconstruction bodies.
What about external oversight, given the international funding involved?
Ideas there include setting up an independent inspector general role to investigate potential wrongdoing. Maybe even having national inspector generals from donor countries, keeping an eye on their specific contributions. Involving bodies like the European Court of Auditors is also mentioned. It all ties back to that donor concern about accountability. But, and this is a key point the U4 report stresses, anti-corruption isn't just technical. It's not just about putting the right procedures in place.
It's political.
Deeply political. Any intervention has to be sensitive to what the report calls the political economy of reforms. You have to understand the power dynamics, who wins, who loses, where the resistance will come from. Reforms aren't just technocratic fixes, they challenge vested interests. That's crucial to remember.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. We've focused on the impacts of the war and the challenges within Ukraine. But how is the war itself seen around the world? The Oxford Global Society source we looked at suggests the picture is much more varied than often portrayed in the West.
It really does. It explicitly calls the idea that the world is united against Russian invasion a fallacy. The report brings together different analyses showing quite divergent perspectives, especially from the non-Western world, as it's often called. And it's important, just based on the source material here, that we report these viewpoints impartially.
Right. So what are some of those contrasting views outlined in the report?
Well, it includes some Western analyses, like Roberts and Wade. While they clearly blame Putin for launching the invasion, they also suggest looking at complex underlying factors.
Like what?
They point to NATO expansion as a major Russian concern. They also frame Ukraine's internal situation partly as an internationalized civil war, highlighting divisions between cultural and linguistic groups, and mentioning actions taken against the Russian language and culture in Ukraine after 2014. Then there's the Russian perspective, as articulated by Newton in the report. For them, NATO expansion is the core issue, seen as an existential threat. Ukraine is viewed as a kind of U.S. bridgehead aimed at weakening Russia.
Okay.
This view is tied to a belief that the U.S. and the West are in decline, creating an opportunity for Russia, maybe with China and others in the global South, to reshape the international order based on what they call civilizational pluralism, basically. Different power centers with different values, not just a Western-led system.
And how do they justify the invasion itself in this narrative?
They use arguments about historical justice, reclaiming lands they see as traditionally Russian, essentially overriding international law based on this historical claim. And paradoxically, they often try to frame this to the global South as a fight against Western imperialism. It's a complex narrative.
How does China feature in this analysis?
The analysis from Zhao Hai suggests China regrets the conflict, but fundamentally doesn't see the world as conforming to one single model of unitary modernity. While officially respecting sovereignty, China is deeply wary of U.S. power, U.S. hegemony, and sees the current international order as unstable and unsustainable.
So they see this conflict as a symptom of a bigger shift.
Yes, potentially marking the end of Pax Americana, that period of U.S. dominance. They also anticipate negative consequences like more political division within Western countries and potentially a global arms race.
What about African perspectives? The report includes analysis from Adebayo Olukoshi.
His analysis highlights that views across Africa are really quite mixed. There's often a discomfort with feeling pressured by the West to take sides. There's also a sense of double standards, pointing to past Western interventions, like in Afghanistan or Iraq, which also raise sovereignty questions.
History plays a role, too.
Yes, historical ties to the former Soviet Union or Russia are a factor for some countries. But fundamentally, many view this as primarily a European conflict. There's a weariness about being lectured by the West on conflicts, especially when conflicts within Africa often get less global attention.
And those economic impacts, we talked about food, fuel prices hit hard there.
Absolutely. The sanctions, the disruptions, they disproportionately affect many African nations. The underlying desire expressed is for a reformed global system, one that's more equitable, where all countries are held to the same standards, not one dominated by Western interests. So many in the global South see this through lenses of historical grievance, perceived hypocrisy, and their own economic fragility.
India's taken a distinctive path, hasn't it?
Yes. Praveen Danthe's analysis describes India's approach as strategic autonomy, basically prioritizing India's own interests and maintaining relationships across different global blocs. They have a long-standing important relationship with Russia, going back to the Cold War, especially for military technology. Something like 60–70% of India's arms are Russian origin.
And Russia is important for India strategically beyond just arms.
Critically so, particularly as a counterbalance to China. India has major border tensions with China and is very focused on the dynamics of the Russia-China relationship. So India doesn't adopt a purely Eurocentric view. Its own strategic calculus comes first. The source even notes some see India as a potential future peace broker because of these connections. India's stance is really driven by deep strategic calculations and its history of non-alignment.
The Oxford source also mentions some other, maybe more sensitive points, like the discussion around nuclear risk.
It does. It notes how a figure like former French President Sarkozy, who suggested compromise was needed to avoid escalation, was heavily criticized, vilified, the source says in Western media. This highlights how narrow the acceptable range of debate became in some places.
And the actual risk of escalation.
The report discusses a perceived lack of serious concern in some Western circles about nuclear escalation risks, particularly after incidents like Ukrainian attacks on strategic bomber bases deep inside Russia.
That's quite sobering.
It is. The report mentions Russia's updated nuclear doctrine, which says even a conventional attack threatening their nuclear capability could trigger a nuclear response. It also cites the perspective from some Russian analysts who feel that the restraining fear of the atomic bomb is gone, leading to calls from some hardliners for drastic measures, even suggesting a public nuclear test as a warning. Again, crucially, these are perspectives presented in the source material, not endorsements. But it shows that these incredibly dangerous ideas are part of the discourse analyzed in the report.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a huge amount of ground here. From the very personal human cost displacement, casualties, right through to the global economic and environmental effects, the massive challenge of reconstruction and corruption, and these starkly different international views.
Yeah. And when you look at all these sources together, what really strikes you is how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
You can't really separate the humanitarian crisis from the challenge of rebuilding transparently.
Right.
And tackling those deep governance and corruption issues inside Ukraine isn't just about aid effectiveness, it's fundamental to building a resilient state. And navigating that complex global stage with all those different perspectives and security concerns directly shapes what's even possible in terms of aid, investment, and ultimately finding any kind of stable path forward.
It really feels like you can't solve one problem without addressing the others. They're all tangled together.
Exactly. To really understand this conflict, you have to see all these dimensions: the human, the economic, the environmental, the governance challenges, the diverse global views, not as separate issues, but as facets of one incredibly complex and tragic reality.
This deep dive has certainly highlighted that scale and complexity from one person forced to flee their home right up to the geopolitical high stakes.
And getting an informed perspective means wrestling with all of it.
Yeah.
It's not enough just to focus on one part of the story.
So maybe we can leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over, drawing from everything we've unpacked from these sources today. Given the immense human, economic, and environmental costs we've discussed, the really deep internal challenges Ukraine faces with governance and corruption, and these profoundly different ways the world sees the conflict and its causes, can reconstruction truly succeed without fundamental internal reforms? And conversely, can any lasting peace be achieved without acknowledging the diverse security concerns and the real global impacts felt far beyond Ukraine's borders?
Something to definitely think about as you process all this information.